it's like you're at 2%.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you guys for having us. Pete, I know a little bit, and I saw him earlier today over in Los Angeles. And I was telling him that I used to work at CNN, and one of my first jobs there when I was like 24 was I was Wolf Blitzer's researcher for his show, The Situation Room. And what that meant was anytime he had a guest come on CNN, I had to like read the book that person wrote the night before. So I had this like pile of terrible political books in my apartment. Like I read like Mitch Daniels' book and like Alberto Gonzalez's book. Political books generally aren't good, but I finished Pete's last week and it's really good. Congratulations. One of the things I like about it is that in the same way that like President Obama was sort of writerly, you clearly read books and love novels and fiction and stories, and you're a really good writer, and that's the thing I liked about it. It takes a little bit of hubris to write a memoir when you're 37, but at the same time, you've done so much, right? Like, as mentioned by, the introduction, Navy veteran, consultant, impressive resume as a mayor. But one thing I want to ask you to start, what does the title of the book mean? Why did you call it that? Shortest Way Home.
So I found that phrase in Joyce, in Ulysses. You're in somebody's head, as you are in most of Joyce, and he's thinking to himself, and he thinks of this phrase, the longest way round is the shortest way home. Actually, he says, you think you're escaping and run into yourself. The longest way round is the shortest way home. And it reminded me of my own story in the sense that I grew up in this town where you got this message as you grew up that success meant getting out. And that's what I did. I got out. And as soon as I did, I began to realize slowly that home really meant a lot more to me than I realized. And in the end, I traveled the world seeking adventure, found it in a lot of ways. But the greatest adventures and the greatest meaning I've had in my life came after I found my way home, wound up in a house literally a couple minutes walk from the hospital I was born in, and around the corner from where I grew up. And that there was as much meaning and adventure to be found within a 1-mile radius of where I started in life as there was halfway around the world. And that's part of what the book's about.
I think that's something not all millennials, but some millennials can identify with. You leave and go to the big city and you feel that pull to go back home, and you actually did it. I think that's cool. One thing this does have in common with other political books is that it is timed with a possible run for office. You're thinking about running for president?
Yep.
You have an exploratory committee, is that right? Why?
Because we're in this moment where there's a total realignment in American society and politics. Like, to the extent that I think even now, we're probably underreacting. And I think that moment calls for very new and different voices than what we're used to. So as a millennial Midwestern mayor, I noticed that you're not hearing a lot from mayors in the national scene. We are now, which is a good thing, but it's not regarded as a traditional way to seek national office. You're supposed to marinate in Washington for years, right, in Congress. But actually, like, cities and towns are the level of our democracy, I would argue, that's working best right now. We want Washington to look more like our best-run cities and towns, not the other way around. A Midwesterner, right, at a moment when it feels like our party has lost touch with the middle of the country, and did so to its great detriment in 2016. And not just the Midwest as a region, but communities like mine that felt forgotten, or where people did grow up with this message that success had to do with getting out. And millennial, because we're also at a moment that I think cries out for generational change. We, belonging to the generation that experienced school shootings as the norm, and the generation that has the most to lose from climate change, and the generation that statistically might be on track to be the first ever to be worse off economically than our parents, if nothing changes. It means that we should also be the generation that's putting forward leaders to try to change that before we get to the sort of ghost of Christmas future where, that's where things wind up. And so, ultimately running for office, I think, is a process where you look at what you bring to the table, you look at what the office calls for, and you scan that to see if there's a match. And there are many times I've gone through that process and decided not to run for office. That's why I didn't run for Congress. I didn't see that match quite fit. But several moments, including this one, I do see that alignment. And what we're doing now is traveling the country and looking for indications on how other people respond to that alignment. And what we're seeing is a response that's really beyond what I could have hoped for.
So I think it's a little quaint to think of presidential primaries in terms of lanes anymore. But it sounds like you're saying that the generational aspect of this is the thing most aligned with what you have to offer.
Probably.
Like millennials are the largest population in this country right now.
Yeah. Yeah, although I'd like to think that, and I've noticed already on the trail, that there's an older generation that appreciates the idea of a younger generation stepping up. That's actually part of what propelled my candidacy for mayor. When I was 29 years old running for mayor in South Bend, it turned out that seniors actually love the idea of somebody young. When you run at my age, your face is your message, almost before you open your mouth. And I do think that there's a lot of power in that. Now, at some point you do open your mouth and you better have something interesting to say, right? So there's a lot that we need to bring to the table in terms of substance, and I have an account of how I think freedom, democracy, and security in the 21st century call for a certain set of solutions. But even prior to that, I think one of the reasons people are showing up to events I'm at and coming to these living rooms in Iowa and New Hampshire and being there to meet me is that generational energy.
So I'm going to give you some batting practice because this is not the first time you've answered this question, and it certainly won't be the last, especially when you're on a debate stage. But last I checked, the population of South Bend, Indiana is 102,000, give or take, which you could fit in the big house at Michigan, almost in the Rose Bowl. It's 1/7 the size of your average congressional district. Why would Americans vote for a small town mayor, as opposed to the mayor of Los Angeles or the mayor of New York or the mayor of Houston?
Right. Well, experience is a big part of how I talk about it. So the experience of, first of all, being a mayor of a city of any size, but especially in our strong mayor system, where you get the call. It could be anything from an economic development puzzle in an industrial park to a racially explosive officer-involved shooting that you got a few hours to get on TV and explain to the community. And when your world kind of varies moment to moment, from incident command to ribbon cutting, I think you get a sense of how executive work in government really is anchored. And to me, it's around three functions. It's implementing good policies, it's capably running an organization, an administration, and it's bringing people together. That's actually the highest and most abstract part of the job, the intangibles of it. I write about how I kind of evolved from thinking about performance and things I could count to understanding the role of the symbolic. All of these are the role of the mayor. And so you can be a very successful, maybe very senior member of Congress or the Senate, but have never in your life been the one on the hook for incident command, or have ever managed more than a few dozen or maybe 100 people. And it's just different when you're responsible for leading a city. And then why South Bend in particular? Because so much is encoded in our story. We're exactly the kind of community that was being promised this return to the past. And I think there needs to be a voice from a community in the industrial Midwest making that case that the right way forward is to look for greatness in what's ahead of us and the way we rise to meet change, not this idea of retrieving it from the past. I believe that you cannot have an honest politics that revolves around the word again. And I think in many ways I'm uniquely positioned to discuss this because my story is one of helping guide a community that was written off as dying at the beginning of this decade and getting it to where now we're growing again. So as you say, this hasn't really resolved itself into lanes, and it probably won't for a while, especially there's like 20 of us. But I do think it's certainly the case that I'm not like the others.
That is correct. I can vouch for that. But what is an emergency or an incident or a crisis or a challenge that you've had as mayor the equivalent of that 3 a.m. phone call that you think can like speak to everyone in this room and signal that like, oh, this guy understands what it takes to make a decision and manage it well, you know, on the national level?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, let's acknowledge that there's nothing like being president of the United States, right? So I get that there is an audacity to really anybody putting themselves forward, including somebody or especially somebody my age or from my background. I want to acknowledge that. And yet everybody who's walked into those shoes has brought the experiences that they have. So some of my experiences involve getting the phone call when an airplane crashed into a neighborhood and trying to figure out that was not in the instruction book, right? To the extent that they actually literally have a rookie school for mayors. It's not an official thing, but at Harvard they invite new mayors and you talk to mayors who've been around for a long time. It's funny because now I'm faculty for this, right? So I'm like grizzled old timer mayor, addressing the folks who just got there. But anyway. One thing they don't tell you what to do is like if a plane crashes into a neighborhood in your city. And we had to figure out what our job even was, right? The feds had a certain responsibility. They came to deal with it. We had to coordinate to see if there was a risk of gas leaks. Were we evacuating people? Can we mobilize buses? I don't run the bus system, but I can help. Another time I was going to bed and it was one of these rainstorms. I don't know what rainstorms are like here, but ours...
They've been bad the last few weeks, right? We had like an inch of rain. Traffic stops.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So our really bad storms tend to come in squalls. You'll get like about 20 minutes. It'll just come on the radar, look like this kind of red shard with green on either side of it. And it'll just blow through. And you'll get this downpour of rain, thunder, and then it'll clear up. And I went to bed, it was that kind of rainfall going on. And then I kind of tossed and turned because half an hour later it was still raining like that, which is odd. Usually it would be done by then. And then half an hour after that, it was still happening. And you could hear gutters overflowing. And I started getting in touch with the fire chief to see what was going on. And an hour after that, we were making the decision to activate the emergency operations center of the city. And by 3 or 4 in the morning, we're figuring out how many houses have been destroyed, how many evacuations need to take place. And again, in some senses, figuring out exactly what people most needed from their mayor, because the fire department has their job, the police department has their job, the Red Cross has their job, but the mayor's got to figure out where the gaps are, what the public needs to know, and invent a game plan for that. The shocking thing is I've had to do that twice in 18 months. One was, I was told, a 500-year flood, and the other was a 1,000-year flood. So we can do the math here, right? And it means things are changing around us. It means that we need to look at climate as a major emergency. But my point is, it's an example of the kind of experience where nobody can really tell you what to do. You just have to figure out how you're going to make a difference. And in our case, it was educating the public about where they should or shouldn't, how they could be safe in an environment where people thought they could kind of walk across areas they couldn't, where to drive, where not to, what we needed, what to do about people who wanted to help but didn't know how to help and were, in some cases, causing a problem by dropping off supplies in places and weren't able to deal with it. Mm-hmm. Look, the job, the most important moments for the job are the moments where it's not in statute what you're supposed to do. And there's nobody else who you've seen do the same thing before. And I also think that, if we're talking about experience, military experience has value. I'm not saying you have to be in the military in order to run for office.
But you'd be the only veteran running in the field, assuming other people don't jump in and make 25 people run. I
would be the first person, I think I would have the most, I know I would have the most wartime experience of anybody to enter that office since George H.W. Bush. Which is strange, actually. But also I belong to a generation where I think that was a big part of our experience. And there's something to be said for that, too.
So I wrote a piece in Vanity Fair a few months ago about a trend in Democratic politics right now that I think is a little troubling. And it's that all of the candidates are being judged a little too much on their identity and what they look like and what the political implications of that are rather than what they're bringing to the table. In other words, can Kamala Harris win in Iowa? It's 90% white. Yeah. Can Sherrod Brown win in South Carolina? What do you say to people who look at you as a white man and say, this party is now dominated by women, this party is dominated by people of color, can you actually win them over? What do you say to that person?
I don't know that the party has to be dominated by anybody. I think one of the things that's to our party's credit is that it brings forward so many people of color and so many women into leadership positions. And I also think that, sometimes this phrase identity politics is used just to kind of wave away any mention of these patterns of exclusion that I think we need to talk about and confront and be honest about. And I think if we get it right, it can actually unite people across lots of different groups. Look, my experience is guiding a city that is a very diverse community. I should probably explain this if all you know about South Bend is that you see 6 times a year that Notre Dame football games are being played there. So we are not the tidy, white, wealthy, homogenous college town you might expect. We are celebrating the fact this year that our per capita income, just for the first time in a long time, went north of $20,000 per person. We are about 45% non-white. And as I mentioned, we've endured some incidents, especially around policing, that put tremendous strain on our unity as a community. I would not have won my re-election with 80% of the vote. I would not have won every district in the city, including the minority-majority districts, competing against candidates of color, if it were not the case that I had found ways to speak to everybody and to demonstrate some aptitude for unifying a community across those boundaries. And I think we really need to talk about how we can reach out across those boundaries, because if it's just about identity lanes, there are unfortunately not quite enough voters in the Maltese American gay millennial veteran mayor lane that I can just scoop it up on identity alone.
You would crush that demo.
That is true.
Yeah, that'd be an expensive poll.
All three of us.
It'd be a really expensive poll to run. One of my favorite chapters in your book was about Mike Pence, and you get a lot of Mike Pence fans in here? Out here in oh, gee, nope. Figured. He was your governor.
Yeah.
He's your vice president.
Yep.
He signed something into law in 2014, was it?
2015,
the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Political nerds call it RFRA. Basically sanctioning the idea of discrimination in private businesses. They have the right to refuse service to gay and lesbian people.
Right.
As a mayor, as someone who cares about economic development, this obviously bothered you, but you smartly wrote about how Pence was able to kind of weaponize culture. And the thing that jumped out at me was, by tying politics so closely to identity, it makes politics way more charged.
Yeah.
It forces people to choose between A and B, Republican and Democrat.
Right.
And you wrote about your grandma. How would the terms of this Mike Pence debate affect your grandma, who's a Reagan Republican, but not super wingnut?
Right.
But if she's forced to make a choice between you're either a right-wing idiot or a woke progressive, which one is she going to choose?
Right.
I think you have also talked about how this is not an asymmetrical thing. I think the right kind of owns the kind of culture wars and demagoguery in a way that doesn't exist on the left. But there is a trend on the left to say you're either with us or you're against us. Yeah. I think it's referred to it by a variety of terms. How do you sort of break that fever on the left?
I mean, part of it, I think, is we can be more inclusive in tone without watering down our substance. So I think we have to be very clear. I mean, on something like racism, for example, right? It's not like the way we're going to try to reach out to people who are not quite where we want them to be is to be like a little bit okay with racism, right? That's not an option.
Buttigieg comes out against racism.
Yeah. Big. Bold stance. No, but this is really important, right? Because what we don't want to do is waver on our values and our commitment to these core values. I also think, though, there's a way of doing politics that acknowledges that politics largely has to do with how people feel about themselves. And good politics is about making people feel good about themselves while doing the right thing. So one example I offer in the context of this controversy was, someone who saw me fairly soon after I came out, conservative society person, more my mother's age or a little older. And she had this like slightly naughty look in her eyes, and she says, "I met your friend, and he is wonderful." So this could be a moment to talk about the difference between a friend and a partner. But for her, this was her signaling acceptance. She felt good about herself that she had gone that far. And I want her to feel good about that, even as I'm still thinking about how to make her also understand that something like transgender equality is about everybody just needing to be treated the same, when that's going to be hard for her to get her head around. But bringing her there, as opposed to basically pointing her in a corner if she's not already there, where the embrace of the religious right will pull her back, is a really important part of how we make progress. And so I think as we think about all the different fault lines, especially when we have leadership, if you can call it that masterfully divides us, right? I mean, really good at using things like race, for example, to divide the working class. Then we have to find ways that people feel a kind of reward for doing the right thing or for heading in the right direction.
Unfortunately, the incentive structure of our politics and our media frequently revolves around Twitter, where the incentives are to call people out, to focus more on, intent rather than impact, or make assumptions about that, call out culture or whatever. That's hard. That's hard to break. But do you use Twitter? Do you get news on Twitter? Do you worry that that platform in particular is making politics more toxic and narrow? Or is it something that you are confident enough to know that, like, hey, most people in South Bend aren't looking at like hot takes on Twitter every minute. They care more about the garbage service.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, the most edifying moments on something like Twitter for me have been when they pertain to garbage service, right? So what I found, I mean, for all the hand-wringing over social media and its impact, like I found that many times when somebody's like yelling at me on Twitter, like, you suck, the city sucks, like this street is full of holes. More times than you would think when I've engaged them, and it's been a real person. I mean, it's important that it be a real person, right? But sometimes it is. And when it is, they should be taken seriously, right? So I've hit on a very simple formula that I use. And I could show you examples. So it's amazing that people could be converted like this, because sometimes they're just looking for some attention. Or they have a problem they need solved, right? So what I do is very simple. I have a formula that's 3 parts, hard to do in the character limit, but you can do it. 1, acknowledge the problem they're mad about. 2, mention something you're doing about it. And then 3, let them know how they can help. So it's like, road is full of holes on Bendix Drive. And I'm like, sorry about that. I know it's pretty crunchy. I drive that street sometimes myself. We are hoping to be able to repave it next year. By the way, road funding is up in the Indiana legislature. And you could do us all a favor and call and let them know how important it is. And more times than not, I get a really positive response. So I think part of what we got to do is just a sorting function where we figure out how much of the stuff coming through any medium is in good faith. If it's in good faith, engage it. Take people seriously. If it's not in good faith, which is maybe the majority of what's on Twitter now, then let it go. Ignore it. It's just people talking to themselves.
If you become president, or the Democratic nominee, will you tweet yourself?
Probably, yeah.
You think that genie's out of the bottle at this point?
I think so. I mean, I don't think I'll do what you're getting right now, right? I mean, you certainly not gonna be like making a policy over Twitter, or like surprising the Pentagon, right, with something that goes out on Twitter. But all of these tools, the real issue, I think, is that the tools are developing more quickly than we're getting sophisticated about how to use them. It's the same with the fake news problem. So I'll give you an example. If you're reading a newspaper, like an actual newspaper, and sometimes your eye falls on what looks like an article, but it's actually a paid It's like a full-page ad that's made to kind of look like newsprint. And after about a second and a half, your brain, just through pattern recognition, realizes that's what it is and moves on to actual articles again. We don't have that same pattern recognition for things like Twitter or Facebook. It takes us longer. It takes me longer to like. Now I actually have some unarticulated, intuitive ways of figuring out who's real or not in that way too. But they're so new, these media, that we don't have that kind of sophistication. That's what makes them so dangerous, I think. But we will. I mean, we will grow into them too, and then figure out where these tools belong. In the long run, I think Twitter basically becomes a kind of more efficient and widespread form of a press release wire. You're using it to talk to the press.
But that's what makes it. There is a panic about social platforms. Facebook and Instagram take the brunt of it, rightly so in many cases. Twitter has, most Americans get news still from traditional media.
Right.
In survey after survey. We all look at our phones all day long, but at the end of the day, we get news from mainstream media sources filtered through a variety of platforms. And local news is still the #1 source of news in this country, or local TV news. Twitter is the thing that reporters, political journalists, politicians, activists, that's where they hang out, even though only a slice of Americans actually do. It has immense power. I mean, how do you manage that? Does the media need to do a better job? Like, what are your thoughts on just like how the sausage gets made every day in the press?
I mean, I think in the end it just comes down to what you actually have to say. Like, what are we putting on Twitter? Is it just our take on everything? Or are we introducing novel ideas? I mean, I learn about things that I wouldn't know otherwise through that process, right? So, like any medium, going back to the days of pamphlets, I assume when pamphlets were new, it was a bit like it was a little hard to tell what was real, right? And you probably thought like, well, this guy's got a printing press. Whatever he's saying must be real. And then eventually you began to learn to distinguish. So look, I think the real problem we have is the multiplicity of channels, actually. Like, it's liberating in a sense, but it's confusing in another, because you don't have the same editorial control. And there's just this bewildering array of places to get information. So we probably wind up going with whatever is most psychologically rewarding in the narrowest sense. And you get that dopamine hit off the like on Twitter, or just seeing something on Twitter that reconfirms something you feel strongly about. Right. But again, I'm not sure that's categorically different than what we've had all along. It's just another format.
Yeah. One thing you might be interested to learn about Mayor Pete is that he won was it a scholarship to Harvard in 2000? That essay you wrote.
Yeah, it was a prize. It didn't cover the whole thing, but it helped a little bit. Yeah.
Well, you won an award for an essay you wrote when you were a senior in high school about politics. You had to choose a subject. And in 2000, he wrote an essay about Bernie Sanders. And you called him courageous and principled because he was sort of allergic to the kind of incrementalism and caution that is too often the case in our politics. That's when he was in Congress. Yeah. Now he's running for president again. Yeah. Did you at the time see him as a role model, and do you still?
In some ways, yes. So I felt that there was this moment where people weren't saying what they believed, I thought, especially on the left. We were so cowed by living in this conservative moment that even Democratic presidents or politicians were saying conservative things, which to me raised the question of why we bothered voting for you. And so what was so interesting to me about then obscure Congressman Sanders was that he just said what he thought. He attached himself to this label that was really suicidal in most contexts, politically, right? Socialist, especially 20 years ago. And just said what he was about. And I wished that more people on both sides of the aisle would just do that. And I really respected that, and still do. I think I have a somewhat different message in 2020 than he does. And I'm certainly a very different messenger. But to the extent that he opened up the conversation and just moved the kind of outer fence post of what we could talk about between right and left, I think that was a very healthy thing. And I think it's good that he's in this process again.
But fundamental to your argument is that you're in touch with the beating heart of young people in this country. I mean, he's 77. Is he too old to run for president?
I don't think anybody's too old or too young. I mean, you got to be 35. It's in the Constitution. But
AOC is too young.
Constitutionally.
Yes.
But, I mean, look, on one hand, it was really embarrassing to see the spectacle of these senators who clearly had no concept of what they were regulating, trying to hold a tech executive accountable in those hearings, right?
They're the only people in the world to make Mark Zuckerberg seem sympathetic.
Senators can make just about anybody seem sympathetic.
Michael Cohen kind of came off good today.
But
Sorry, those are House members.
it's not just about age, right? John Dingell just passed away at, 90, whatever. He was one of the best masters of Twitter that I've ever seen. So it's not only about age. I do think, though, there's a conversation to be had about this generational change. 3 out of our last 4 presidents, we don't think of it this way because they entered our consciousness at different ages, but Presidents Clinton, George W. Bush, and Trump are all precisely the same age. They were born within a few weeks of each other in the same summer of 1946. And so I think there is an awareness. And what's interesting to me is that awareness is something that I think a lot of voters of that same generation share and even express to me when I'm on the trail. That we're kind of due for a bit of a watershed moment here.
When I was watching the State of the Union, Trump made that comment about how we're not a socialist country, clearly trying to use that word as a cudgel, as he does. But one of the first people to his feet to give a standing ovation was Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. Those are establishment Democrats who understand how to win elections. But 58%, I think, of Democrats, according to an NBC poll this week, are fine with the term socialism and the Democratic Party trending in that direction. But a majority of independents, and obviously Republicans, are not. In other words, the majority of the country is not comfortable with that word. Yeah. How do you navigate that if you're swimming in a Democratic primary when you're getting all of this outside pressure from, Justice Democrats on Twitter, and Ocasio-Cortez is putting out some audacious and interesting policy, and that gets rewarded among Democrats? How do you navigate that and swim back to the middle? Or is that something that we don't even need to do anymore? At
risk of sounding simple-headed, I think the way you navigate it is you endorse the ideas that you're for and you oppose the ones that you don't think make sense. I think that's part of how this word has lost its meaning, right? It used to be like you come up with some idea and then the other side doesn't like it, so they call it socialist, and then it's not safe anymore. But it's lost its power more and more. First of all, because it was thrown around so much, right? So the Affordable Care Act, invented by conservatives at the Heritage Foundation, based on market principles, first implemented by a Republican governor, and then when a Democratic president is smart enough to steal that idea and implement it, suddenly it's socialism, and is characterized as such by the people who don't like it. And so the more it gets thrown around loosely, the less it means anything. But also, I think, from a generation that didn't grow up in this era when you had communism and socialism here, kind of the same thing in people's imagination. And then you had democracy and capitalism here, also the same thing. So if you were for socialism, that meant you were with communism, which meant you were against democracy. And I think that just doesn't compute for anybody my age or younger. Because we're living in this moment when socialism could mean Venezuela, but it could mean Denmark. It could mean social security. And what's really interesting in the moment we're living in is the tensions that are arising between capitalism and democracy. And the real question is, when those tensions arise, do you defend capitalism over democracy, or do you defend democracy over capitalism? Those are the questions that I think need to be answered for our generation. And so in terms of whose approval ratings are where on the idea, look, I think we got to remember that the conduct of these campaigns changes the answer to some of those questions, right? The fact that Bernie Sanders got in 2016 changes the numbers on socialism among Democrats for 2020. And we got to recognize that there's more to campaigns than just trying to get over the finish line. The conduct of the campaigns matters. And Republicans were very smart about this. They ran super uphill campaigns in the 60s with ideas that seemed preposterously far out when Goldwater campaigned on them, and then became mainstream by the time Reagan campaigned on them. Or at least the second or third time Reagan campaigned on them and actually won. And that was how conservatives began to win not just an election, but an era. And I think serious progressives should be thinking about how we set the conditions for our values to be in the ascendant over the next 20 or 30 years, not just how we get through 2020.
We're going to take audience questions in just a moment. I have one more question for you. You've distinguished yourself in these early conversations by proposing some pretty bold things around institutions and structural reform in our democracy. Just last week, you suggested you'd be on board with court packing. But you have talked about abolishing the Electoral College. Mm-hmm. To play devil's advocate on that, wouldn't that just re-scramble the deck and put attention and resources on all the big cities that are the big population centers in this country? In other words, the current Electoral College forces people to campaign in rural places, in admittedly swing states, but places like Ohio. They have to spend time addressing the concerns of small town America. Yeah. Without the Electoral College, aren't you just campaigning in Chicago and Houston and Boston and just trying to rack up as many of those votes as possible?
I think that certainly would have been true in the era when campaigning, getting in front of a voter meant you had to literally physically get in front of them. I think that is less true each passing year. So yes, you have to want to physically go to a lot of places and campaign there, but it's also true that there are more ways than ever to reach somebody. To me, this idea of doing away with the Electoral College is a good example of something that maybe reads as being bold because it's structural, but it's also super common sense. Like, I think at the end of the day, most Americans get that the person who gets the most votes probably ought to win, and that everybody ought to have the same voting power as everybody else. Like, these are not complicated principles. And so the fact that they're regarded as like way far out, to me, is not an indication of how far out the idea is. It's a matter of how warped our version of what the center is. And I think we can fix that by talking about these ideas in the open.
Great. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks.
We're going to do some questions now. Let me know what to do with the... Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thanks, Toby.
Hi. So my question was about Puerto Rico. I have family there that was without power for 7 months after the hurricane, and I wanted to hear about kind of relief for the hurricane, but also just like systematic relief, like if you have a position on statehood or on like getting rid of the Jones Act or anything like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very clear that we have to expedite. The way that this aid has been jammed up with FEMA is inexcusable. And I think it is also symptomatic of a deeper issue, which is that Puerto Rico lacks full political representation. I think this never would have happened if the votes of our fellow U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico were taken as seriously as the votes of people in Ohio or some swing state. My answer on statehood is not as simple as the D.C. answer, where my answer is just do it, because they're U.S. citizens living in the U.S. mainland and they should have it. Only because I think we should show regard for Puerto Rican self-determination here, right? And so I guess the way I would answer it is that if Puerto Rico is ready for that and the Puerto Rican people are, then we should welcome that. I also say, though, we should not let that debate be a barrier to having representation in the Electoral College, because I think some of these things never would have happened if there was full representation. And these are our fellow U.S. citizens. So again, we've gotten into this world where because things have been a certain way for a long time, we're okay with it. But it doesn't actually make any sense. And we have to be willing to make a change.
Hi.
Hi.
Let me rephrase this, is pluralism a threat to democracy? Why or why not, in your opinion?
Oh, that's... Can you say more?
Can I say more?
Yeah, like what? I want to make sure I understand the ways in which pluralism might be a threat to democracy.
Partisanship.
Or do you want me to just take it like an exam question and go with it as best as I can?
Partisanship, do you think? Yeah, like partisanship and how
I see. Okay.
how there's such a large political divide.
Got
and
it.
is that a threat to democracy right now?
I would put it a slightly different way. I would say that those kinds of things are a threat to society when democracy is not working well. In other words, the whole idea of democracy is that it lets us negotiate that pluralism and get to a place that's fair. And it's why we have a complicated democracy, right? A representative Republican democracy that isn't majority rule. It avoids the tyranny of the majority as much as possible, but also honors the majority. And again, as I believe in things like presidential elections, probably ought to honor the majority a little more than we do. When you have a healthy democracy, it can negotiate these issues in a way that benefits people. When you don't, then the real problem that you get is capture. So you'll have some really powerful interest. And I don't only mean like a well-moneyed interest, but just some group that can claim outsized influence because of the way the districts are drawn or whatever it is. And then it creates distortions that harm others, and then that, I think, leads to outcomes that make people more divided. So when I think, for example, about why my part of the country voted the way it did in the last election, I think a lot of that was because our system failed to ensure that promises that were being made to very different groups of people could be kept. Especially the promises that were being made about how economic growth, if we just loosened regulation and embraced trade and other things, the economic growth would be so great that it would benefit all of us. And what happened was the economic growth was great, the rising tide rose, but a lot of the boats didn't budge. And a lot of those boats were where I live. And that's why a lot of people where I live who are under no illusions about the character of the current president went in there and voted a certain way anyway for basically the purpose of sending a message or burning the house down, because that's how excluded they felt. And these patterns of exclusion are deepening in our society. The whole idea of democracy is it gives us a way of getting to better outcomes. And I think that the right kind of outcomes benefit enough people that those tensions that happen across our pluralistic society are moderated by the fact that we all sense that we're getting better. When that stops being true, when many of us or most of us are not getting better, then people begin to turn on each other. And then when you have a president who's making that actively worse by helping turn people against each other, then it becomes very dangerous. My faith in democracy is that we can use democracy to fix that before it's too late. But only if we're really democratic. And if we're in a world where money can outvote people, where districts are drawn so that politicians can choose their voters instead of the other way around, where people in Puerto Rico can't have a voice in the Electoral College, where people in Indiana or California might as well be in Puerto Rico for all the influence we can have on presidential elections most years, where the Supreme Court is on a slippery slope toward being a nakedly political institution. These things add up. And it's under those conditions that a pluralistic society starts to become a dangerous place to live.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really interested to hear more about your thoughts on the role of young people in politics, specifically how youth can enable, kind of crossing of bridges, or how young people can play a role in, electing a Democratic mayor in a really red area. And kind of along the same lines, how young people, what young people can bring to the table, even if they're perceived as having less experience than other people, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So I think part of it is to really honor the extent to which the younger you are, the longer you're planning to be here. By definition, the more you have at stake, right? I mean, we heard the president was challenged on a budget issue recently and the problems that would create in the future with these tax cuts for the wealthiest. And I think he literally said, I won't be here. And if you're thinking, I will be here, God willing, 2054, I get to be the current age of the current president. That's personal for me. Somebody younger than I am has that much more at stake in the decisions I make as mayor. A lot of times I think young people, especially intelligent, active young people who want to be in and around the political process, are sort of patted on the head and told, you're the future. This happened to me a lot when I was running for chair of the DNC. They're like, you're the future of the party. I like you. not going to vote for you, but I think you're the future of the party. And I was trying to have a conversation about the present. But the beauty of our system in many ways is that it accommodates, or it can, if people are willing to take it, accommodate a major impact from young people. And this is one of the things I love about the local level. So unlike Congress, where you actually have to be invited to go testify, young people can just show up and speak when a state, often, or certainly a city body is entertaining a piece of legislation. And sometimes they do, and sometimes that changes the answer. I have a group of young people, we renew it every year, but it's a diverse group of high school students organized into a youth task force that aren't even old enough, many of them, to vote, but they help shape my thinking. I invite them to the table, and the things they help me understand about what's going on in our schools, I'm not talking about picking out the flavor of ice cream in the cafeteria. I'm talking about things like violence, right, that they want us to confront. They have a voice that needs to be heard. Now, the exciting thing about the moment we're in is that unlike this is a generational moment, I think, like the 1960s in some ways. And in the 1960s, young people made colossal change. The difference is, if you look at a time like '68, there's a lot of young people fighting their parents. It was a moment of generational conflict. What we have now, I think, holds out the promise of a generational alliance. I think about the Parkland students and the March for Our Lives, students basically calling out those in charge for failing to keep them safe. But you look at those marches, and what's remarkable about them, almost all of them organized, certainly the ones in South Bend were organized by high school students. But you saw, in many cases, their parents at their side cheering them on. And so I think we also have a chance to speak to the best instincts in people of any age, which is an instinct to support those who are coming next. It's not a universally felt instinct, but it's there. And I think young people who are organized and have a plan and don't wait their turn and don't take no for an answer and participate in these processes, but also engage not just fellow young people, but people at every level, have the potential to change everything. And if you think about how major social changes happened in this country or any country, it very rarely has happened without the intervention at a large scale of young people.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm a Scripps politics major and a senior, and I just wrote my thesis on the separation of children and families at the southern border. So my question is about immigration, and I volunteered while writing my thesis at a immigration detention center just like 40 minutes away from here. And so I would like to ask you, as president, or running for president, what your stance on immigration would be, but also, this is not the first time the U.S. has detained families and children based on political and racist thoughts and the current climate. So how would you make lasting change so that's less of a political pawn to use families when this generation of children are going to be our generation growing up in the U.S. in the future?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for the work that you're doing, because that's really important and really timely. Look, I'm here because of immigration. My father immigrated to this country, and that's why I'm here. And most of us, unless we're descended from the First Nations, have that in our story. Either came here or were brought here. We wouldn't be the country that we are. We wouldn't be able to do anything, even now in terms of growth, without this rich tradition of immigration. In our city, it is the reason, my job is to boast of our city's growth. We started this decade on a list of dying cities, and now we're growing again. But if you took out immigration, our growth in South Bend would be net zero. You can often measure the economic vitality of a state or a city or a country by the amount of immigration that's happening. And so we need to recognize that this is fundamental to our ability to succeed in the future. The shocking thing about the current policies is that they are based on this othering of human beings that makes them something else in some people's eyes. It's the invention of a crisis, but it's not just the invention of a phantom crisis, it's the creation of a real crisis, the crisis you're helping deal with, a humanitarian crisis, manufactured by bad policy. And whatever the agency is that's in charge of enforcing that policy, if it's a bad policy, people will be harmed. To me, the solution has to do with comprehensive immigration reform, which is a great example of what's wrong with our democracy, in that most Americans can get on board with comprehensive immigration reform along the lines, let's say, of what was passed about a decade ago in the Senate, only to be killed in the House. We can come together on the basic terms of protecting dreamers, creating a path to citizenship, cleaning up pathways for lawful immigration, and then doing whatever is reasonable around border security. We all more or less get that. But just because the American people have something resembling a consensus doesn't mean the American Congress can actually do it, because of the makeup of the Congress and, of course, the lack of leadership from the White House. The truth is that the current White House benefits from immigration being a problem. And if you're better off with a problem being a problem, then you're not motivated to solve it. But the lack of a solution is happening on the backs of families that are on the short end of this policy. And it's hurting our entire country, whether you were one of those families or not.
You mentioned that global warming was one of your favorite issues that you wanted to deal with because you're going to be dealing with it longer. And how would you deal with that issue?
Well, first of all, I think we're finally having a debate over just what it would take to tackle this issue. What the Green New Deal gets right is twofold. First of all, treating it like the real national emergency that it is. And secondly, recognizing there's actually a lot of economic power in how we rise to meet that emergency. The jobs that can be created. Right now in South Bend, one of the biggest expansions of union auto worker jobs in my county recently was for a company based out of Santa Clara making electric vehicles. The need for us to mobilize for this is imminent. I mean, I don't need to tell you about parts of California catching on fire. Not to mention my experiences in the Emergency Operations Center in South Bend, or when I go to a mayor's conference talking to Florida mayors who were dealing with sea level rising affecting their city today, not someday, today. And so it's part of what I talk about when I talk about security. And we need to frame this as a security issue because lives are on the line. And we can't survive long dealing with a major existential security issue if one side isn't even willing to acknowledge the issue is real. It's one thing if we have a common goal and we're weighing the best way to get there. But we simply have to leave behind. There's not enough time left to persuade the people who don't think this is a problem. The good news is I think more and more people get that it is. Now, to get from here to the goals that are laid out in the Green New Deal framework is not obvious. That's okay. It was not obvious how we were going to get to the moon when President Kennedy pinned his political capital to the proposition that we would do it within a decade. The important thing is to elevate it to the right level of commitment. In today's inflation-adjusted dollars, the Manhattan Project would have been about, or the Moon Project would be about $10 billion each. So that might give you some benchmark for what we ought to be spending on the R&D side of things, just to help make things like renewable power more accessible. I also think we need to look at how cities are built and how we support cities in becoming more sustainable. It's not very present in the early resolutions going around Congress, maybe because they don't think like mayors, but it's something I think mayors could bring to the table. But fundamentally, we have to begin by establishing these aggressive and ambitious targets and then daring ourselves to do whatever it takes to get there. Because the right, for people who argue over, is 2030 a realistic year to do some of these things? The right timing, scientifically, economically, the right moment is yesterday. So all we can do is race to get there as soon as possible before it's even more too late than it already is.
Hi there. I loved everything you had to say tonight. I thought it was fantastic.
Thanks.
And also, I loved everything you had to say in your letter from Flyover Country in December 2016, which was kind of a very, obviously, turbulent time, especially at these campuses.
Yeah.
But one thing you also mentioned was how Democrats have lost, or at the time had lost sight of state and House races.
Yeah.
And now here you are running for president instead of taking, in my opinion, the governor's seat of one of the worst people who ended up in politics today. Mike Pence. So I'm just kind of curious why kind of you're not more focused on governorship, especially given, I mean, you already addressed the limited experience, but given kind of being mayor in Indiana and taking that nationally.
So I guess for me it's that, because frankly, if, as Chasten sometimes points out, on our first date when he was wondering whether it was a good idea to go on a date with a politician, he asked me what the future might look like. And that was when I was just starting to run for my second term. And I told him an answer that was truthful at the time, which was that I was hoping to win a second term and that if all went well, then if I had a really successful 2 terms as mayor, then I'd get a look for running for governor. The point being, he got a little more than he bargained for in terms of what we're doing right now. But I also don't believe in running for an office so you can run for some other office. I believe in considering running for office when you see an alignment between what you bring to the table and what is needed. And what I bring to the table in this national conversation is something I think nobody else can. I care about who the governor of Indiana is because I live in Indiana. But there are more people, first of all, obviously, the idea that there needs to be more Midwestern Democratic voices in the national space is not something I can contribute in Indiana because everybody in the Indiana debate is from Indiana. But also, frankly, the things that I'm trying to change and the things that make it hard for me to do my job as a mayor even, many of those are structural national questions that I feel that nobody else is talking about in the way I want to talk about it. And I also feel like I have an opportunity here to try to shift the altitude that Democrats are talking about issues at. So right now, Democrats, just out of habit, tend to do everything in terms of policy. We go right into the 14-point plan. And then we let people try to figure out what our values must be based on the policies. Very different from what happens on the right, where, as we talked about, they try to win the values debate and then litigate policies based on values. But by then, they've already won. And I see an opportunity by entering this conversation to try to bring us both higher and nearer to the ground. Higher because I don't see a lot of Democrats talking about freedom. And I don't see a lot of Democrats talking about what security means in the 21st century. And certainly not a lot who have wartime experience and are ready to say, as somebody who served in uniform, that we need to bring an end to endless war. And I don't see the account of repairing our democracy that I think I can bring to this conversation happening there. But also, I'm trying to contribute a mayor's eye view to the national level because I think national politics needs to be held accountable to what it means in everyday life. And I don't see a lot of that happening. We need to talk about how healthcare decisions are personal decisions in our lives. We can talk about the structures and debate single payer and the rest of it, but we've also got to talk about what it actually means. And as somebody whose life has been formed and shaped in such intimate ways by the decisions of politicians, I'm hoping to return our political debate, our political dialogue, to one that is accountable for the ways in which our lives are changed by better or worse political decisions. As somebody who was sent to war on the orders of a president, as somebody whose marriage exists by the grace of a single vote on the US Supreme Court, I want people to understand that our politics and our politicians must be held accountable for the day-to-day impact of the freedoms that they enhance or infringe on. And for better or for worse, even though this is an improbable moment for somebody like me to do something like this, and it makes me an underdog, and I'm entering this process as a newcomer, but I've got to do it because that project, by its very nature, is national. And so, a long way from home, and I wish I were with my dogs right now. But for that purpose, tonight, I belong in Claremont, not in South Bend.